This is the Nintendo Switch Pro Controller. Is it good for fighting games? Let's find out. When you think of pros, you think of trigger locks, additional paddles, back buttons. This is not that. This is just a regular controller. And for context, I'm using this on the PC to play fighting games. Let's begin with the build quality. This thing is solid. Just rock solid. And it just looks really cool. This is a see-through controller. Look at this. You can see the chips inside. You can play this wirelessly via Bluetooth on the PC, or you can just plug it in. If you're familiar with the Xbox layout, you can be right at home with this controller. Here's the two side by side. They're very similar in size. The Switch controller is a little thinner and the handles don't angle out as much. They both have offset joysticks, but on the Switch controller, the joysticks are a little bit domed base. And there's this ledge for you to hold on to the stick caps. It's really nice actually. The stick caps is really sticky. They rotate super smoothly. Yeah, these joysticks are really nice. In terms of tension, I would say this is just a tad bit heavier than on the Xbox controller. At first glance, the bumper and the trigger buttons are Xbox style. However, this trigger here is actually not a trigger at all. It looks like a trigger, right? But it's actually a button. It's just so satisfying to use this button. With a lot of controllers with trigger locks, the problem with that is that the travel is so short and they usually use my switches that makes it super fast, so the timing is off with the D-pad. But not in this case. The switch that they use and the travel on this is exactly like a regular button. And of course, that really helps with fighting games. These are the most reliable and consistent triggers that I've ever used on any controller. Doing moves like this, easy. And both of these buttons, they feel the same. They use the same switch. You can go back and forth between these two super easily. You can press it from the outside or the inside, no problem. Let's move on to the face buttons. As you can see, these are very similar to the Xbox controller. However, on the Xbox, it's flipped. So if you use this controller, you're used to A being here, then B being over here, X over here, and Y is up here. But on this guy, A is over here, and X is over here instead of Y. Initially, this drove me crazy. And I get it, okay? This is how it's always been with Nintendo controllers. The good news is if you play on Steam, you can actually switch these around. Now the other difference between these buttons versus on the Xbox is if you look at the Xbox controller, you can see how the buttons are laid out perfectly in a diamond shape. What that means are the spaces between every button here is the same. Now that's not the case here. You can see the face buttons are squished. The Y button and the A button are further apart than the X and A and the Y and the B buttons. Well, you may ask yourself, that's a small change. What's the problem? The right joystick is gonna get in the way whenever you press the Y button. It's just super annoying. The stick just barely touches my thumb. Right now, if you have fat thumbs, it's gonna be even worse. Had these face buttons not been stretched out like this, that would have been perfect. Check this out on the Xbox controller. See that? There's a good gap here between my thumb and the stick. And then look at this. Come on, man. In terms of the switches, these are pretty clicky and tactile. However, they're kind of heavy. I'm pretty sure these are rubber dome based switches. The thing about these switches is when you press it in and then when you let go, there's a lot of resistance coming out right away on these switches. Think of these switches kind of like pressing against springs. The A and the B buttons are close enough where you can press both at the same time. Same thing with the X and the Y buttons. However, when you want to press B and Y and A and X, is a little strange because the Y button is kind of moved out a little bit. So you have to angle your finger like this to press both of them at the same time. And same thing with A and X. So it's a little awkward at first, but you get used to it over time. Alright, let's get to the D-pad. The D-pad uses the same switches as these buttons, so they're kind of heavy and clunky. But I will say this though, they are responsive and they are tactile. You really feel them. This is just your regular cross-shaped D-pad, nothing fancy here. This D-pad's on the smaller side and it works really well. The surface of the D-pad is matte, and let me tell you, this thing is smooth. You can glide your thumb back and forth very easily. This D-pad has a lot of height and travel to it. And if you're like me, I like to use my D-pad on the edges so I feel it. In the beginning, my thumb would get stuck, especially when I try to do a half circle forward. My thumb will get stuck here. Go here and it's stuck, and I have to push it past it to go up. Not so much the other way. It's a lot smoother. And that's because of the way your thumb is angled, right? And if you do a wiggle test on this D-pad, it's pretty stiff. Of course, there's always going to be a little bit of movement, but with this guy, you can see it doesn't jiggle a lot. You have to really force it. Because this D-pad's on the smaller side, that means the gap between these buttons are smaller, making it easier for you to do diagonals. Look at that, no problem at all. Motion inputs are on point with this D-pad. Quarter circles. No problem at all. Double quarter circle. Look at that, piece of cake. The other way. I can do all of my combos on this D-pad very consistently. It's very accurate. Check that out. 15 hits. Circular motions are super easy as well. No problem at all. Double 360s. For those of you who play charge characters, sliding motions. Double slide. Motion inputs on this guy is just fantastic. The only thing I'll say is if you press back or forward, kind of up here on the upper edge of the D-pad, you're gonna jump, right? And that happens on a lot of D-pads. So make sure you press back instead of angle it up like this. And that's especially important when you do Z motions. So you press out first and then you do your Z motion. Super quick. If you play Street Fighters or any games that uses heavy motion inputs, this D-pad is just great. And I would say it's also good for 3D fighters as well. On wired, the polling rate is barely 71 Hz, and the stability is under 60%. What that means is the average input delay is 14 milliseconds. And on Bluetooth wireless is even worse. Polling rate 63 Hz, stability barely over 50%, average input delay almost 16 milliseconds. And this put the controller as one of the worst or one of the slowest controllers that I've ever tested in terms of the polling rate. And it really is a shame because the hardware itself is really good. There's quirks about it, but overall it's really, really good. But it's just so slow and sluggish. Look at this. If you play casually, you probably don't notice it, but I wouldn't use this controller if you're playing it competitively. Alright, final thoughts. I really like the hardware of this controller. It looks great, it feels great, it's ergonomic. I love the trigger buttons. These are my favorites on any controller. And overall, it's just really accurate and easy to use. If you plan on getting this controller for fighting games, I highly recommend you play wired and then overclock this bad boy, because as it stands right now, it's just super slow and sluggish. While I was using this controller, I can't help but think, what if Nintendo actually makes a proper Pro controller? something like the DualSense Edge or the Xbox Elite Series controllers with back buttons, customizations, and things like that. That would be sick, wouldn't it? But for right now, what we have here, this is a very, very solid controller. Alrighty, that's gonna be it for me. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like, subscribe for more, and take care now.